The glass is green, not the bright green of something manufactured with color in mind, but the old, uneven green of a bottle made before anyone thought much about what glass should look like, a greenish gray. Really, with a slight cloudiness where the surface had been in contact with seawater for longer than anyone standing on that beach had been alive. Andrew Leeper turned it slowly in his hands. The Shetland Islands in April have a particular quality of light, low and pewter colored, coming in sideways off the water, and in that light the bottle threw no reflection worth speaking of. It was simply heavy and old and sealed. Through the curve of the glass, pressed flat against the interior wall, the way a document presses flat inside a frame, a postcard was visible. The handwriting on it was still dark. The date on it read August 1914. Leeper was a retired postal worker. He had walked this stretch of shore before. The Shetland Islands sit in the North Atlantic at a latitude that catches a great deal of what the ocean chooses to set down, and people who live there have a habit of looking at what the tide brings in, not urgently, but with the attentive patience of someone who has done it long enough to know that the tide is not always uninteresting. On this particular morning, in April 2012, what the tide had left him was a bottle that had been traveling since the summer of the First World War. 98 years had passed between the moment someone sealed it and the moment he picked it up. The postcard inside had not moved. The bottle had been released as part of a drift study run by Glasgow University, one of many bottles sent out over the years from different points in the northern seas to trace where currents would carry them and to learn through the patience of waiting for someone to find them and send word back, something about the slow, enormous movement of the water. Most bottles from that era were never recovered. This one had been carried and rested and carried again and eventually arrived at a particular shore on a particular morning when a particular person happened to be walking. The postcard inside asked whoever found it to record the location and date of discovery and return it to the address printed on the card. Leeper did exactly that. The bottle was confirmed by the appropriate authorities as the oldest verified message in a bottle then on record. The postcard was 98 years old and legible and had been waiting in the glass this entire time. There is something about the weight of old glass. Bottles made in the early 20th century have a density that newer ones do not. The manufacturing process was different. The silica and other materials compressed in a way that gives the finished object a presence in the hand. When Leeper lifted that bottle from the stones, he was holding not just the bottle, but the weight of a specific era, a specific vessel, a specific person who had sealed a postcard inside it and released it into water that the world then called the North Sea, in a summer that would turn out to be the last ordinary summer for a very long time. None of that is visible in the glass itself. The glass is just glass, and yet the fact of it sits there, settled and complete, in the weight of the thing in two hands, on a gray Shetland morning, nearly a century after it was made. 3 years later, and further south, on the shore of the Baltic Sea near Kiel, in northern Germany, a woman named Marion Winkler was walking the tide line on an ordinary morning. The Baltic in April has its own particular quality, lower and quieter than the North Atlantic, pewter-colored in a slightly different way. The shore near Kiel tending toward flat and unspectacular, the kind of coast where the interest, if there is any, comes from what the water has left, rather than from any drama in the landscape. Winkler was not, by any account, on a specific errand. She was simply walking in the way that people who live near the water walk, as a thing done regularly, without destination. Among the stones and the ordinary debris of the tide line, she found a bottle. Inside it was a postcard, printed in careful ink. The postcard was dated May 17th, 1906. Guinness World Records, after examining the evidence, certified this as the oldest recovered message in a bottle ever found. 108 years and 138 days of verified ocean drift. The postcard had been released as part of a Marine Biological Association drift study in the early 20th century. It had traveled the Baltic Sea and whatever connecting waters the currents had carried it through, sealed against the ocean, for slightly more than a century before, arriving at the feet of a woman who had not expected to find it. The handwriting on the postcard was still legible. The printing on its face was still readable. It had simply waited, in its glass, in the water, for 108 years, and then it was found. What the Guinness certification involved was a careful examination of the postcard itself, its material, its ink, its printing, the date recorded on its face, and the records of the original Marine Biological Association studies from that period, which were meticulous enough to be cross-referenced. The bottle was authenticated not by any remarkable quality of the object itself, but by the thoroughness of the records on both ends. The records of the release, still preserved in institutional archives, and the evidence of the postcard, still readable in Winkler's hands on an April morning in 2015. The oldest message in a bottle on record was confirmed not because the glass was extraordinary, but because the records were good, and because a woman in sensible shoes happened to stoop and pick up something from the stones. There is a particular pleasure in the fact that both of these discoveries, the 1914 bottle found in Shetland and the 1906 bottle found near Kiel, were made by people doing entirely ordinary things. Neither Leeper nor Winkler was searching for anything. They were simply present on a shoreline, doing what people do near water, and the water had placed something in their way. The bottles had been crossing the surface of the sea in their quiet, unhurried fashion for most of the time that had elapsed since they were released. They had no awareness of being anywhere. They had simply been carried, and eventually the carrying stopped, and someone was there, far to the south and west of the Baltic, and many years before Marianne Winkler's morning walk, a bottle was making a longer journey. In 1944, as part of an oceanographic drift study conducted jointly by the United States Navy and allied scientific institutions, a number of bottles were released at specific locations in the South Pacific. The study was interested in the behavior of surface currents in that part of the ocean, in the broad, slow movement of water that connects the eastern coast of Australia to the coastlines of South America and returns by way of deep southern routes, a gyre that operates on timescales far longer than any single study was designed to measure. The bottles were released and noted, and the study moved on, as studies do, to other questions. Nearly 4 decades passed. In 1983, on a coastline in New Zealand, one of those bottles was found. It had been drifting in the South Pacific for 39 years. The details of its recovery have the particular quality of facts that arrive without drama: a bottle on a beach, a note inside, a date that places the object far outside the ordinary span of such things. The bottle was traced back to the 1944 study. Its recovery position, plotted against the release point nearly 40 years earlier, confirmed theoretical models that oceanographers had been building about the long-duration transport capacity of the South Pacific gyre. The way the current could carry a floating object, steadily and without urgency, for decades and thousands of miles, and eventually set it down on a shore that was not entirely unlike the one it had left. The bottle's arrival in New Zealand in 1983 was, in its way, data. It was evidence of a physical process operating on a timescale that no individual human observation could easily hold, But it was also a bottle on a beach in the afternoon light, 39 years after someone sealed it and let it go. New Zealand shorelines have a particular character on the days when the wind is low and the surface of the water is flat. Wide beaches, the light coming in at angles that illuminate the wet sand differently, depending on the hour, the ocean still moving, but quietly as if considering its next direction. The bottle that arrived there in 1983 had crossed thousands of miles of open South Pacific, and the shore where it finally stopped was wide and wind-washed in the way of coasts that face open water without much interruption. It settled into the wet sand with the same absence of event that marks the end of any long drift. It was simply there after nearly 4 decades of not being anywhere a person could point to. The confirmation of the 1944 study's theoretical models was, from the perspective of the oceanographers who received the recovery report, a satisfying result. A bottle released in a particular location had been carried by the South Pacific Gyre in approximately the direction the models predicted, at approximately the rate those models suggested, and had arrived on approximately the expected coastline within a time frame that matched the theoretical outer limits of gyre-driven transport for floating glass objects. The theory had been correct. The gyre had done what the models said it would do. It had just taken nearly 40 years to provide the confirmation, which is the kind of timescale that makes oceanic research a particular kind of endeavor, one requiring patience of a duration that exceeds most institutional memories. Closer to home, and in a register that is less institutional and more simply personal, there is the story of a girl named Paula Grosvenor. In 1956, she was young enough to find the act of sending a message in a bottle genuinely exciting, the kind of act that feels, at a certain age, like a test of the world's willingness to respond. A small dispatch sent out to see if anything answers. She released a bottle off the coast of England, somewhere along a shoreline that was familiar to her, with a handwritten note inside bearing her name and her home address. She was, at the time, a child with an address in England and a bottle in the sea in front of her, and she did what children with such materials have done for as long as bottles were sealed and coastlines were walked. The bottle was recovered, according to the story that drew regional press attention. Decades later, during a family walk along the coast, the person who found it was her own grandchild. This is the detail that gives the story its particular quality, not simply that the bottle was recovered, which happens, but that it was recovered by someone whose existence was not yet imaginable on the day it was released. Paula Grosvenor let go of her bottle as a young girl, with her name inside it and a home address that would eventually become part of a family's history. By the time the bottle came to rest on a shore within walking distance of her own life, she had become a grandmother, and her grandchild bent down to pick up a piece of glass that had been waiting in the water for longer than either of them might easily calculate. The note inside still bore the name of the girl she had been. The story attracted regional press coverage because it had the shape of a story, the circularity of it, the multi-generational return, the grandmother's handwriting in the hands of a grandchild who had not yet been born when it was sealed. What the regional press coverage could not do, and did not try to do, was account for why the bottle returned to within reach of the same family, rather than washing up on a shore in Denmark or Scotland or the Faroe Islands, which the currents off the English coast are perfectly capable of delivering objects to. The sea has no interest in the neat arc of a story. It carries what it carries and sets things down where it sets them down, and the circularity, if it appears, is a coincidence of currents rather than an intention. But coincidences of currents are real. The currents off the English coast do have particular tendencies. Objects released in certain directions from certain points do tend to wash up in certain kinds of places. The bottle's return was not impossible. It was simply a long way from certain, and it happened. There is a particular image in that story that is worth holding for a moment. A grandchild, on a walk with family along a shore, bending towards something half buried in wet sand at the tide's edge. The hand that reaches for the bottle does not know what it is reaching for. The glass is cold and salt-filmed and heavy in the way of old glass, and the paper inside is pressed against the interior wall, and the handwriting on the paper, when the bottle is held up to the light, belongs to someone the child knows, someone who was present at the family table, at the familiar occasions, who is known by face and voice and name. The handwriting was made when that person was younger than the child holding the bottle is now. The family walk continues, but more slowly while this is understood. Off the coast of Nova Scotia, the water is cold in a different way than the water off England or the Shetland Islands or the Baltic shore near Kiel. It is cold in the way of the North Atlantic where it approaches the edge of the continental shelf. Deep cold, with currents that run strong and unpredictable, shaped by the particular geography of that coastline and by the broader movements of the ocean beyond it. Fishermen who work those waters know the cold the way people know the character of a place they have spent years in, not as a single sensation, but as a set of particular facts about particular seasons and particular winds. In 1988, a local fisherman released a bottle near Sable Island off the coast of Nova Scotia containing a personal message. Sable Island sits roughly 300 kilometers southeast of Halifax, a narrow crescent of sand in the open Atlantic, famous for its horse population and for its history of shipwrecks. It is a place where the sea and the land exist in a relationship that is visibly and persistently contested, the island's shape changing year by year as the water reshapes its edges. A bottle released near Sable Island enters water that has strong opinions about where to take things. The currents there are not gentle, they are purposeful in a way that is simply directional rather than intentional, but their effect on floating objects is confident and consistent. The bottle the fisherman released near Sable Island was, some years later, recovered by members of his own family along the Nova Scotian coastline. The recovery was documented in regional Canadian press as a remarkable example of a bottle returning, almost symbolically, to the community from which it had originated. The fisherman had sent something out from the cold water of his working life, and the cold water had eventually returned it to people who shared his name and his landscape and his particular familiarity with that stretch of ocean. The phrase the coverage used, almost symbolically, is careful and accurate, almost because the sea does not traffic in symbolism. The bottle's return was a consequence of current patterns and wind directions and the particular shape of the Nova Scotian coastline, which tends to catch things coming in from the open Atlantic in predictable ways. But the outcome had the character of something that meant to happen, even if nothing about the physical process involved any intention whatsoever. The family members who lifted the bottle from the Nova Scotian shallows were standing in the same cold water their relative had worked in. They knew that water in the particular way of families whose lives are organized around a coastline, by its moods, its seasons, its reliable inconveniences, and its occasional generosities. When they recognized in the bottle they lifted from the shallows the message that had been sent out from this same water some years before, they were not standing at the edge of something foreign or distant. They were standing exactly where they always stood, and the sea had returned something to them from their own life. carried back by the same currents that governed the water they already knew. There is a quality these 5 cases share that is worth naming plainly. None of them required anything spectacular of the sea. The bottles were not propelled across unusual distances. The recoveries were not made under extraordinary conditions. Andrew Leeper was walking ashore he had walked before. Marian Winkler was moving along a tide line. She knew. The New Zealand coastline, where the 1944 bottle arrived, was simply a New Zealand coastline, receiving what the South Pacific brought it. Paula Grosvenor's grandchild was on a family walk. The Nova Scotian family was standing in familiar water. What made each recovery remarkable was not the circumstances in which it happened, but the time that had elapsed between the sending and the finding, and the fact that the bottles, in all that time, had simply continued to exist. Glass is a very old material. The recipe for making it, silica, heat, the slow cooling that produces a substance both rigid and fragile, has been known for thousands of years, and what has always been true of well-made glass is that it does not degrade with any urgency. Left alone in conditions that do not shatter it, glass will persist. A sealed glass bottle in open water is in physical terms a very stable object. The seal holds the outside out. The glass holds its shape. The paper inside, protected from direct contact with seawater, does not receive the conditions that would most aggressively unmake it. The bottle rides the surface of the ocean, and the surface of the ocean moves, and years accumulate, and the bottle continues to exist and to travel. What these 5 cases present, then, is not a mystery of any kind. They are not puzzling. They do not require explanation in terms of anything other than the ordinary behavior of sealed glass objects in moving water, and the ordinary behavior of people who walk coastlines and notice what has arrived there. The 98-year bottle on the Shetland shore, the 108-year bottle near Kiel, the 39-year bottle on the New Zealand coast, the bottle that returned to Paula Grosvenor's family, the bottle that came back to the Nova Scotian coastline. These things happened because bottles float and currents move and people walk on beaches and notice things. The only thing that is not ordinary about any of it is the span of time involved, and even that is not extraordinary in the way that physical processes operate. Decades are long in human terms. They are not especially long in oceanic terms. The water had somewhere to be. The bottles went along. But the span of time is real, and it is worth sitting with, not as something that ought to produce unease, but as something that is simply large and genuinely interesting. The postcard that Andrew Leeper turned in his hands had been inside that bottle through both world wars. Through the invention of commercial air travel and the moon landing and the development of the internet and every decade of change that those years contained, the bottle had been in the water through all of it, not observing, not aware, not changed by any of it, simply floating, sealed, with the postcard inside that still had its date printed on it, August 1914, the month after the First World War began. The postcard had no opinion about the intervening century. It had simply been there, inside the glass, continuing. Marianne Winkler's bottle, the one dated May 17th, 1906, had been in the Baltic Sea for longer than she had been alive. Longer than almost anyone alive in 2015 had been alive. The person who sealed that postcard and sent it out from a research vessel somewhere in the North Atlantic or the connecting waters of the Baltic had been dead for decades before Winkler was born. The institution that had organized the drift study still existed, as institutions tend to when they are organized around things that last. The questions about ocean movement, the systematic recording of where things go when the sea takes them, but the individual human being who who had written the date on that card and sealed the bottle and released it over the side of a vessel, was long gone by the time it was found, and the card they had written arrived 108 years later on a quiet stretch of Baltic shore on an ordinary morning, and was picked up by a woman who did not know it was there until she saw it. The fisherman from Nova Scotia, the girl on the English coast named Paula Grosvenor, the Navy and Allied oceanographers who released their numbered bottles in 1944. Each of them made a particular kind of act when they sent their bottles into the water. They committed an object to a process that they could neither control nor follow. The bottle, once released, was entirely the ocean's. Whatever direction it went, whatever coastline it eventually arrived at, whatever condition the paper inside was in when someone finally opened it, none of that was within the reach of the person who had held the bottle last. Sending something into the sea is, in purely practical terms, an act of complete surrender of the object. The bottle belongs to the current now. The current will decide. What makes this worth thinking about, at least briefly, is the quality of patience it implies. Not patience in any active sense, because the people who released these bottles did not spend years waiting and watching the horizon. They released the bottles and continued their lives. The fisherman went back to fishing. The schoolgirl went home from the beach. The Navy drift study moved on to its next station. The patience was embedded in the act itself, in the simple fact of having made the bottle and sealed it and released it in the knowledge that whatever happened to it would happen entirely out of sight, in water that covered more of the planet's surface than any person could meaningfully picture, at a pace that might not produce a result within any individual's lifetime. The patience of the bottles themselves, which is not patience in any living sense, which is simply the patience of an object that continues to exist without diminishing, is a different kind of thing. The bottle does not wait, it drifts. The distinction between waiting and drifting is the distinction between having an interest in arriving and being simply carried. The bottles had no interest, they were carried anyway, and they arrived. On the shore of the Shetland Islands, on the tide line of the Baltic near Kiel, on a wide beach in New Zealand, on a family walk along the English coast, on a stretch of Nova Scotian water, where a family stood in the cold shallows of a sea they already knew. In each of these places, at its own particular moment, something arrived that had been traveling for a very long time. The water brought it, the shore received it, someone bent down and lifted it and held it in their hands and found, inside the old and heavy glass, a piece of paper with words still on it, from someone who had stood at the edge of this same water, years or decades, or a century before, and given the bottle everything they meant to send, and let it go. The Nova Scotian family lifted the fisherman's bottle from the shallows in the unhurried way of people who are already standing somewhere familiar. The water around their feet was cold, as it always was. The light off the surface was the particular light of that coast in that season. The bottle was heavier than it looked, or lighter, or exactly what they expected, the weight of glass filled with air and paper, which is to say nearly weightless, which is to say more substantial than you would think. They held it up, the cold Atlantic running off the neck of it, and inside the glass the message from their own family floated, suspended, intact, still legible, still exactly what it had always been. The sea had carried it out, in its own time, by its own roots, and the sea had carried it back. And here it was, in hands that knew the same water it had come from, dripping gently and complete. Prince Albert I of Monaco stood at the stern rail of his research vessel somewhere in the open North Atlantic and held a sealed glass bottle over the water for a moment before he let it go. The bottle was small enough to hold in one hand, Inside it, folded against the glass, was a card printed in several languages: French, English, Spanish, Portuguese, German, asking whoever found this bottle to note the date and location and return the card to the Musée Océanographique in Monaco. The ship was moving forward at a steady pace. The bottle, when he released it, was not. It dropped the short distance to the surface and hit with a low, clean sound, and then the wake of the vessel moved out from underneath it and left it sitting in still open water, tilting slightly as the swell passed beneath, the glass catching the gray Atlantic light for a moment before the ship had moved far enough ahead that it was simply gone from view. Albert could no longer see it. The bottle did not know this. It had already begun to drift in the direction the surface water was moving, which was the only direction available to it, and which it would follow without any awareness of following, for however long the sea chose to carry it. This was the late 19th century, and Albert was among the first people in the world to treat that drift as information. He released hundreds of bottles from his vessels over the course of his oceanographic career, and he tracked the ones that came back. The cards returned from coastlines he had expected, and from coastlines he had not, and the pattern of those returns, plotted carefully on charts, began to show him something real. Not a theory, not a model proposed in an office, a physical fact, confirmed by the movement of glass and paper across open water, that the surface of the North Atlantic was organized into a slow, continuous rotation, and that objects released into it would follow that rotation whether anyone was watching or not. What Albert was mapping, though he did not yet have a complete name for the full system, was the North Atlantic Gyre. It is a large clockwise turning circulation of surface currents that connects the coasts of Europe, North America, and Africa in a single continuous loop, moving warm water northeast from the tropics, then east across the open ocean, then south along the European coast, then west again along the African coast, and back into the tropics to complete the turn. It is not a fixed channel. It does not have edges the way a river has banks. It is more like a broad, slow rotation of the entire upper surface of the Atlantic, the whole width of it tilted slightly, year after year, in the same long clockwise direction, carrying whatever the water carries with it. The gyre does not move fast. Parts of it move at speeds measured in kilometers per day rather than kilometers per hour, which means a bottle entering the system in one location might take months or years to cross to another. This is why many historically documented bottle recoveries in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and the Azores are attributed to the gyre's influence, not because the water rushed the object to shore, but because the water moved steadily in that direction, and the object was simply in it, and eventually the shore arrived. Albert's bottles confirmed the direction of those movements long before satellite tracking and electronic buoys made the measurement routine. The cards that came back from the Azores, from the west coast of Ireland, from the beaches of southern England, each one added a data point to a chart that was being drawn in real time by the sea itself. He was not the only person doing this kind of work, but he was among the most systematic, and the records he kept eventually fed into early international efforts to describe the North Atlantic surface circulation in terms precise enough to be scientifically useful. The mechanism behind the gyre's rotation is wind. Not any single storm or seasonal pattern, but the large persistent wind systems that circle the Earth at mid-latitudes, the trade winds, which blow steadily westward in the tropics, and the westerlies, which blow steadily eastward at higher latitudes. These winds exert a continuous frictional drag on the ocean surface below them, pushing water in the direction they blow. Where two wind systems meet, the pushed water curves and turns. Over the width of an ocean basin, over the span of months and years, that curving accumulates into something coherent, a gyre, a slow, sustained basin scale rotation with no beginning and no end, running as long as the winds above it continue to run. The surface currents generated by those winds operate in the upper 100 to 200 meters of the ocean, a relatively thin layer at the top of a very deep column of water. Below 200 meters, the wind's influence on water movement essentially ends. What takes over beneath that layer is something entirely different, a circulation driven not by wind but by differences in temperature and salinity, water made denser by cold or by the evaporation of salt moving slowly downward and away from the surface, replaced by water rising from elsewhere, the whole deep ocean turning in cycles that operate on time scales of hundreds or thousands of years rather than months. A sealed glass bottle floating at the surface has no access to that deep circulation. It rides the wind-driven layer and nothing else. The immense, cold, slow movements happening below 200 meters are invisible to it, irrelevant to it, as far from its trajectory as the geology of the seafloor. What the bottle encounters is only this thin, lit, wind-pushed surface layer, and within that layer it moves wherever the current and the wind above the water agree to take it. This matters for understanding why bottles go where they go, and why some bottles traveling apparently similar routes end up on very different shores. The shape of the bottle affects how much of it sits above the waterline, which determines how much surface area the wind can push directly. A bottle floating high will respond more strongly to wind than to current, while a bottle floating low, nearly submerged, will be more thoroughly governed by the water moving beneath it. The orientation of the bottle, whether it floats upright or on its side, changes the profile it presents to the wind. Whether its seal is tight enough to prevent any water ingress determines whether it keeps its buoyancy consistent across months or years, or gradually becomes heavier and lower in the water as small amounts of seawater find their way through a loose cork. Glass bottles sealed with cork or wax have demonstrated the greatest longevity in historical drift records. The glass itself does not degrade in seawater, it does not become waterlogged, it does not absorb salt in ways that change its buoyancy. It is chemically stable in the marine environment in ways that wood, leather, metal, and most organic materials are not. A well-sealed glass bottle carrying a dry paper message inside it is, in physical terms, close to an ideal drift object. Stable, buoyant, impermeable, and durable enough to outlast almost anything else the ocean might carry at the same time. The North Pacific operates under a similar organizing principle. The North Pacific Gyre is a clockwise rotating surface circulation sitting in the northern half of the Pacific Ocean, bounded loosely by the currents running along the coasts of Japan and North America, and the systems crossing the open ocean between them. Objects released or lost from the coastlines of Japan and the Philippines have been documented arriving on the shores of Hawaii, Alaska, and the Pacific coast of North America after journeys that, in several cataloged cases, exceeded 6,000 miles of open ocean travel. Curtis Ebbesmeyer, an oceanographer who spent years studying the movement of drift objects across the Pacific, built a substantial body of research around precisely this kind of documentation. At a desk surrounded by recovery reports, drift maps, and decades of accumulating data, he developed methods for tracing the trajectories of floating objects, not messages in bottles specifically, but any object the ocean chose to carry: buoys, containers, shoes, industrial spills of manufactured goods released from container ships in storms. Each recovered object was a data point. Each recovery location and date combined with the known or estimated release location and date, described a segment of a trajectory. Enough trajectories described enough of the ocean's surface circulation to allow predictions, reasonable guesses at least, about where an object released in one location might eventually arrive. The work was painstaking. Recovery reports came in from beachcombers, fishing operations, and coast watchers across the Pacific Rim, each one a fragment of a larger picture being assembled slowly, coastline by coastline, season by season. Ebsmeyer's research gave a systematic scientific framework to what had previously been documented as isolated curiosities. The bottle found on a beach, the boy washed ashore far from where it was released, and showed that these individual arrivals were not random, were not accidents in any meaningful sense, but were the predictable outcomes of a physical system operating according to its own consistent rules. The center of the North Pacific Gyre is worth describing, though not in terms that belong to any moral or ecological argument, simply as a physical feature of the ocean that has been documented as a consequence of the gyre's rotation. At the center of a clockwise turning gyre, water converges from all sides and has nowhere to go. It accumulates there, and with it accumulates whatever is floating on the surface. In the North Pacific, this convergence zone has been shown to collect floating debris on a scale consistent with what the current patterns would predict, which is to say, very large. Objects from every coastline that borders the gyre eventually migrate toward the center. The same physics that has carried glass bottles from Japan to Alaska operating on everything else the gyre picks up along the way. Ebsmeyer added data points to that larger picture from his desk for years, noting coordinates on charts that slowly accumulated into something approaching a map of the gyre's entire surface, behavior, trajectories crossing and recrossing the Pacific, arcing along the coast of Alaska, dropping south along the coast of North America, cutting west across the open ocean on the North Equatorial Current, and looping back toward Japan. The chart, by the time he had been working on it for a decade, covered more ocean than any single ship had ever crossed in a season. The scale of these systems is worth sitting with for a moment. The North Atlantic Gyre is roughly the width of the Atlantic, and the Atlantic is roughly 5,000 miles wide at its broadest. The North Pacific is wider. These are not features of the ocean in the way a bay or a strait is a feature. They are features at the scale of ocean basins themselves, organized by the rotation of the Earth and the circulation of the atmosphere above them, operating continuously and without interruption on timescales that dwarf any human institution. Prince Albert was releasing bottles into a current system that had been rotating in essentially the same configuration long before any European vessel had crossed the Atlantic. It will continue rotating long after any concern about any individual bottle has faded entirely. This is not a large observation or a dramatic one. It is simply the fact of scale that sits behind every recorded bottle drift, that the bottle traveled not through empty water but through a structured moving system, and that the system was doing what it has always done, carrying things in directions organized by wind and the shape of ocean basins and the rotation of the Earth, indifferent to whether what it carried was a scientific drift card or a handwritten letter or a marriage proposal or a child's name on a piece of paper. The trade winds are consistent enough across the tropics that navigators have relied on them since the earliest long-distance ocean crossings. They blow from the northeast in the northern hemisphere and from the southeast in the southern, and they are consistent in ways that the weather at higher latitudes is not. A vessel in the tropical Atlantic in the 15th century could count on the trade winds to push it westward. A bottle released in the same waters today can count on the same thing. The water beneath the trades runs westward too, pushed by the wind dragging over the surface across thousands of miles of open ocean, the current building as it goes, gaining volume and speed as it approaches the Americas. Where the North Equatorial Current hits the eastern coast of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, it is deflected northward, warming as it travels along the American coastline and then curving northeast into the open Atlantic as the Gulf Stream, a fast, warm, narrow river of water moving through the broader ocean at speeds that in some reaches approach 9 kilometers per hour. This is fast for a surface current. A bottle entering the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida moves toward Europe at a pace that, in favorable conditions, could complete the crossing in a matter of months rather than years. The Gulf Stream was known to navigators as a practical fact centuries before anyone had a systematic explanation for it, because its warm water was visible against the cold Atlantic around it, and because ships in it moved differently than ships in the water beside it. East of the Atlantic, the current system slows and broadens as it approaches the coasts of Europe, the water spreading and cooling, some of it moving north toward Iceland and Scandinavia, some of it circling south toward the Azores and the Canary Islands, and eventually back toward the tropics along the eastern Atlantic in what is known as the Canary Current. The loop is not perfectly closed. Water enters and leaves the system through various exchanges, but the general clockwise organization persists, the same dominant pattern century after century, the same general tendency to deliver objects released in the western Atlantic to the eastern Atlantic, and to recirculate objects in the eastern Atlantic south toward Africa and eventually west again. It was this loop that Albert's bottles were tracing. The cards that came back to Monaco from the Irish coast or from the Azores were not accidents or coincidences in any meaningful sense. They were the expected results of releasing objects into a known current system, expected not because anyone had verified the result before, but because the system was doing what physical systems do when given time, distributing objects across the surface according to the rules of wind and current that govern all surface movement. The surprise, if there was one, was only in the specificity of where individual bottles arrived, which particular beach on which particular island, which particular fisherman or walker happened to be in the right place at the right time to recover a small glass object and read the card inside. A similar loop governs the South Atlantic, a counterclockwise gyre rather than a clockwise one. The southern hemisphere gyres rotate in the opposite direction, a consequence of the Coriolis effect. The tendency of moving objects on a rotating Earth to deflect left in the southern hemisphere rather than right. A bottle released in the South Atlantic is carried not clockwise but counterclockwise, west along the tropics, south along the coast of South America, east across the open Southern Ocean, north along the African coast, and west again. The same physics, the same wind-driven organization, the same patient, indifferent transport system operating on the same timescales, simply rotating the other way. The South Pacific gyre operates on a similar counterclockwise pattern, encompassing the wide lower half of the Pacific in a slow turn that connects the coasts of South America, New Zealand, Australia, and Antarctica's fringes in a single continuous movement. Objects released into this system travel with it, carried south and east across the Pacific by the Southern Ocean's powerful westerly winds, the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, the strongest and most persistent wind belts on the planet, and deposited eventually on whatever shore the trajectory leads to. New Zealand sits in a position relative to this gyre that makes it a natural collector of South Pacific drift objects. Its southern and eastern coastlines face directly into the prevailing eastward flow of the Southern Ocean system, and objects originating from South American waters, from the southern Pacific, or from the drift zones around Antarctica arrive there with a regularity that reflects the underlying current structure. The isolation of the country's coastlines, wide, wind exposed, relatively unpopulated compared to their total length, means that objects arriving there can sit undiscovered for extended periods, which is itself a record of the current system's patience. Wind does not only drive currents, it also acts directly on objects floating at the surface, pushing them independently of the water beneath them. This direct wind effect, called windage or leeway in navigational terms, is what makes the floating behavior of individual objects more complicated than any pure current model would predict. A bottle that floats high in the water with most of its body above the surface will be pushed by the wind in addition to being carried by the current, and the wind and the current do not always agree about direction. On most days in most ocean regions, the wind and the surface current align reasonably well, because the wind is what created the current in the first place. On some days, and in some regions, they do not. This discrepancy is part of why two bottles released at the same point on the same day can arrive at coastlines hundreds of miles apart from one another, or arrive at the same general coastline separated by months or years. One bottle rode slightly higher, caught more wind, moved faster, or in a slightly different direction. One bottle was sealed more tightly, maintained its buoyancy more consistently, kept its orientation more stable over the long months of its journey. One bottle crossed a particular latitude at a moment when the current was behaving slightly differently than usual, following a warm water anomaly or an eddy that carried it briefly off the main transport path. The ocean surface is not uniform. Even within a gyre, even along a well-documented current system like the Gulf Stream, the actual water movement at any given place in time is more irregular than any simple diagram suggests. Eddies spin off the main current and carry objects into temporary circular loops. Countercurrents run briefly against the dominant flow. Storms mix the surface and push water in directions the prevailing wind would not have chosen. A bottle making a journey of months or years across an ocean basin encounters all of these variations, and each one adjusts its trajectory slightly, so that the path it actually travels is never quite the clean arc that a current map would draw. This is what makes drift object research scientifically valuable even now, when satellite altimetry and drifting electronic buoys can measure surface current velocities directly in real time. A sealed glass bottle traveling for 40 or 80 or 100 years is integrating all of those variations across a time frame that no electronic instrument could survive, recording in the simple fact of its final location the net effect of every eddy, every storm, every seasonal shift in the current that it encountered along the way. Where it arrives tells you something that instantaneous velocity measurements cannot, what the average behavior of that stretch of ocean has been across a very long time. Prince Albert understood something close to this in the terms available to him in the late 19th century. Precision of his instruments was nothing like what modern oceanographers work with. The charts he was building from bottle recovery data were rough by any current standard, dots on a map connected by inference rather than measurement. But the method was sound. A drift object released at a known location and recovered at a known location on a known date provides two fixed points and a time interval, and those three numbers describe a trajectory even if the path between the 2 points is only approximately known. Enough trajectories begin to describe a system. He released bottles from different positions across the Atlantic, from different latitudes and different longitudes, from different seasons, and he tracked which recoveries came back. The pattern that emerged was consistent. The gyre was there, doing what it was doing, whether or not any scientist was watching. Albert was simply making its behavior visible in a way that could be written down and compared and shared with other people who were trying to understand the same ocean. The westerlies that drive the upper latitudes of the North Atlantic are not as consistent as the trade winds, but they are persistent enough to organize the current beneath them into the eastward flowing North Atlantic current that carries water and occasionally sealed bottles from the western Atlantic toward European shores. This current is the same one that gives the western coasts of Ireland and Scotland their disproportionately mild climate. Warm water brought northeast from the tropics by the Gulf Stream, releasing its heat into the atmosphere as it cools. The climate of coastal communities that have been finding drift bottles for centuries has been shaped partly by the same current that delivered those bottles to their shores. There is something quietly satisfying about this, that the warmth of the Irish coast and the arrival of drift objects from the western Atlantic are products of the same circulation, that the people who live in the landscape the current made are also the people who have historically found the objects the current carried. The connection is not metaphorical. It is the same water, the same movement, the same physical system operating on heat and flotsam and sealed glass bottles with equal indifference. Albert's later voyages extended his bottle release program further into the Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean presents a different situation from the open ocean. It is a semi-enclosed basin with its own circulation patterns, less directly governed by the major Atlantic gyres, with tighter loops and more complex exchange dynamics at the Strait of Gibraltar, where Mediterranean and Atlantic water meet. Bottles released in the western Mediterranean have been documented arriving on the shores of the Eastern Basin, on the coasts of North Africa, on the islands of the central Mediterranean, following the internal circulation of the basin rather than the large Atlantic system outside it. Albert released bottles there too, and the returns from those bottles added a different set of data points to his growing picture of how water moves in enclosed, as well as open bodies. The research that followed his in the 20th century built directly on the methods he had established. Systematic drift bottle releases became a standard tool in oceanographic studies, with programs in the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, the South Atlantic, and the Southern Ocean, all using sealed containers released at known positions to confirm and refine current models. Some of these programs released hundreds or thousands of bottles simultaneously, deploying them in grids or transects designed to map the current behavior across a specific region. The return data, some bottles came back within weeks, some within years, many never came back at all, built up into data sets that could be compared against theoretical models and used to calibrate them. The bottles that never returned were not failures, they were also data. A bottle released at a particular position that was never recovered could be inferred to have followed a trajectory that did not lead to an inhabited or regularly walked shoreline, or to have sunk at some point along the way, or to have entered a convergence zone and remained there. The absence of a return was itself a signal about where the water moved, what coastlines it avoided, what parts of the ocean received surface drift, and what parts did not. Curtis Ebbesmeyer's work in the Pacific made similar use of the objects that did return, treating each recovery not as an isolated curiosity, but as a contribution to a continuously growing understanding of the gyre's surface behavior. The bottles and buoys and manufactured goods he tracked were proxies for the water, each one showing, by where it arrived and how long the journey took, what the water carrying it had been doing. The gyre was already rotating. The bottles were simply making it legible to people standing on shores. Outside the main gyre systems, smaller scale circulations govern drift in coastal and semi-enclosed waters. The Baltic Sea, where several historically significant bottle recoveries have been made, has its own distinct circulation driven by the freshwater input from the rivers that drain into it, the salinity gradient between its surface and depth, and the wind patterns over the relatively shallow enclosed basin. A bottle released in the central Baltic follows different paths and arrives at different shorelines than a bottle released in the open North Atlantic, the basin's own internal logic governing where things go rather than the large Atlantic circulation outside it. The Shetland Islands sit at a junction between the open North Atlantic and the influence of the Norwegian coastal current, which runs northeast along the Norwegian coast and draws drift objects toward the Scottish island chains that sit in its path. These are not curiosities. They are the mechanism behind the recoveries. Every documented case of a drift bottle arriving at a particular shore, the product of a specific current system, doing what that system does. The warm water arriving on the western coast of Ireland arrived there because the North Atlantic current carried it. The drift card recovered in the Azores arrived there because the subtropical gyre circulated it south. The bottle found on the beach in the Shetland Islands was delivered by the same system that has been depositing drift material on those shores for as long as the current has been running. The slow rotation of the North Atlantic gyre is not something that can be seen from any shore. It is too large and too gradual for any single vantage point to reveal. What can be seen is only the local expression of it, the direction of the wind on a particular afternoon, the temperature of the water at the surface, the direction of the swell rolling in toward the beach. The gyre itself is only visible when enough individual data points are placed on a chart, and the shape of the underlying system emerges from the pattern they make, the way a constellation becomes visible only when enough separate stars are considered together rather than one at a time. Albert's bottles, the Marine Biological Association's numbered cards, Ebbsmeyer's Pacific Drift catalogs, each of them contributed separate data points to a picture that required many data points before its shape became clear. The ocean did not announce its circulation patterns. They had to be inferred from objects released and recovered, the gap between departure and arrival described in miles and months and seasons, the whole slow business of the sea's surface movement revealed through the patient accumulation of small glass objects sent out from ships and beaches and found, eventually, far away, by people who had not been looking for them. That is the picture the data describes, a thin surface layer of the world ocean, pushed by wind into broad rotating systems, carrying whatever the water carries in directions organized by currents that move without any knowledge of what they are transporting. A glass bottle with a sealed cork and a dry paper message inside fits that transport system as well as anything that floats. It enters the current. It follows the gyre. It moves in the direction the wind has made the water move, and it keeps moving until the shore finds it, or until a net brings it up, or until it settles into a convergence zone and drifts in slow circles at the center of a system that has been turning for longer than the bottle has existed. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, at this moment, the surface current is moving at roughly the pace of a person walking slowly. It is moving east and slightly north, in the upper 100 meters of water, pushed by the westerlies running above it. The water has no awareness of its direction. The direction is simply what the physics of wind and rotation produces, again and again, across the whole width of the ocean. A bottle floating in that layer rides the same movement, at the same pace, carried steadily toward whatever shore sits at the end of that long, unhurried, patient drift. A child's hand lets go of a glass bottle just as a wave comes in. The wave is small, the kind that barely reaches the ankles, and for a moment the bottle is simply there in the white water, tilting sideways, the paper inside catching the pale morning light before the surface closes over it. Then the undertow takes it. The bottle moves through the shallower green of the wave's retreat, and then through the darker water beyond, and the child on the shore in Cornwall watches it go, standing very still while the sea moves around her feet until the bottle is too far out to follow with her eyes, and the water has simply absorbed it. The teacher has been watching too. There are 22 children on this beach, each of them having released a bottle of their own in the last few minutes, and the sea is already carrying them in different directions without any apparent preference. Some bottles have moved along the shore, some have gone straight out. One has come back, briefly, before a small wave turned it again and sent it seaward for good. The teacher makes notes on a clipboard. The children wade back up the beach in their waterproof trousers, talking to each other about which bottle went farthest, which went fastest, whose name is inside. This is a science lesson, organized and deliberate, aimed at introducing children in coastal school programs to the basic principles of how water moves. The program that brought these particular children to this particular Cornish beach has been running in various forms for decades, and it is one among many like it, operating along the coasts of England, Nova Scotia, Cape Cod, and the southwestern edge of Australia. Children's bottles released in these programs have been recovered hundreds of miles away. Some have been found thousands of miles from the release point by people who had no way of knowing that a child with wet shoes had once stood in shallow water and watched the glass disappear. The finders send letters or postcards back to the schools. The schools put the recovery reports on notice boards, sometimes for years. The child who let go of the bottle off Cornwall is not the only one who has stood on a beach wondering where it went. What is worth paying attention to in these programs is not just that the bottles travel far, but that the people releasing them are very young and are being asked, through the act itself, to entrust something to a process they cannot see or control. The teacher describes the currents. The children understand the lesson in the abstract, but the act of letting the glass go into the water is something else, a physical education in patience, in release, in the plain fact that some things simply take a long time and cannot be hurried. Sailors have understood this far longer than any school curriculum. A merchant sailor on a long North Sea passage in the middle of the 20th century would have carried a particular relationship to the water beneath him that differed substantially from the relationship of a passenger or a holidaymaker. The sea was where he worked. He measured it in swells and soundings, in the rate at which weather moved, and the color of the water in different depths. And when he sat down to write a note for a bottle, because merchant sailors and deep-sea fishermen and the crews of vessels working remote commercial routes have done this steadily and consistently throughout the recorded history of such things. The information he included was precise, practical, and framed in the specific language of someone for whom the ocean was a professional address. The ship's name, the date, the coordinates at the time of release, the vessel's current route, and intended port. These were not romantic gestures, or they were not only romantic gestures, they were the notes of someone who knew that the information might genuinely matter, that a recovery position combined with a release position could tell someone something real about the water between the 2 points, and that a sailor's name attached to a ship's name attached to a position, was a form of record keeping that felt natural to anyone who spent their working life logging such things. North Sea fishermen, in particular, left a documented trail of bottle releases throughout the 20th century, recorded in the maritime heritage publications of Scotland, Norway, and Denmark. Vessels working the waters around Iceland added to this record. The Bering Sea, that particular cold and difficult body of water between Alaska and Siberia, produced its own set of documented releases from commercial fishing crews who worked it across the decades. The bottles these sailors sent were not primarily ceremonial. They were sent because the sea was where these men spent most of their time, and because a sealed bottle set into the water from a working vessel was a small, effortless act with an unpredictable outcome, and because sailors, more than most people, were comfortable with unpredictable outcomes. A fisherman's bottle is different from a schoolchild's bottle. The handwriting is different. The choice of information is different. The paper is often folded more tightly, the seal applied more carefully, because the person doing the sealing has some working knowledge of what a bottle faces once it leaves the deck. The coordinates are written first, before the name, because for someone who navigates by position, the position is the primary fact. The date follows, in the same abbreviated format used in a ship's log, and then, if there is space and inclination, something more personal, a home port, a brief note about the weather, occasionally a direct address to whoever eventually finds this and is reading it now. Written in the second person, not as an artistic choice, but as a simple acknowledgement that the finder is a real person whose existence the sender has briefly considered. These bottles are the ones that tend to come up in trawling nets, years or decades after release, nowhere near any coastline. They are found by other fishermen, in the open water, far from any shore a walker might visit on a Sunday morning. That is its own kind of recovery, not the find at the tide's edge, but the find in the middle, hauled up with the catch, the glass intact, and the seal still holding after years of deep cold. The Marine Biologic Association of the United Kingdom prepared approximately 1,020 drift bottles for systematic release between 1906 and 1916. These were not personal messages, they were scientific instruments. Each bottle was sealed with a standardized printed postcard inside, numbered requesting that the finder note the date and location of recovery and return the card to the association. The bottles were released at regular intervals from research vessels crossing specific tracts of the North Atlantic, and the returned cards created, over time, an early empirical picture of how water moved at the surface in that part of the ocean. The preparation of these bottles would have been methodical and quiet work. A row of identical glass bottles set on a surface, a row of identical postcard inserts, each one bearing the same printed instructions in careful text, each one numbered differently to distinguish its point of origin. The insertion of each card, the placement of the cork, the sealing of the cork against water ingress with wax or another material. Then the bottles loaded onto the vessel, stored in a crate, brought out at the designated position, and released over the side, one by one at planned intervals, not with ceremony, but with the patient attention of scientists, whose goal was data, and who understood that the data would only come back if the bottles were prepared carefully enough to survive. The association recovered data from a meaningful portion of those bottles. Some were found within months, some were found years after release. 1. A bottle released in 1906 was not found until 2015 on the Baltic coast near Kiel by a woman named Marian Winkler walking a familiar shoreline on an ordinary morning. The card inside was still readable. The numbered sequence placed it within the original study. The The postcard had been traveling for 108 years. The motivation behind the Marine Biologic Association's releases was curiosity organized into a system, the specific kind of curiosity that belongs to institutions willing to wait for data without knowing when or whether it will return. Individual senders carry a different kind of motivation, one that is harder to generalize and more varied in its emotional texture. A man standing at the coast of Virginia in the late 1990s with a sealed bottle in his hand was not thinking about drift data. He was thinking about a specific woman and a question he had decided to ask her in a particular way. The bottle he released from the coast near Virginia contained a marriage proposal. He had written it out by hand on good paper, addressed it to her, sealed the bottle, and put it into the water. What the bottle was supposed to do after that is not entirely clear from the reporting, whether he intended it to be found by someone who might pass the message on, or whether the release was primarily the act itself, the gesture of sending something important out onto the water as a way of marking the seriousness of what he was asking. Regional media in the United States reported on the story. The case became one of the more widely cited examples of the romantic symbolic weight the gesture carries, and the gesture does carry that weight, has carried it for a long time in popular culture and in practice. Couples have formally incorporated bottle releases into wedding ceremonies and anniversary rituals. The act of sealing a record of a relationship inside glass and giving it to the sea on an important day has a logic that is not difficult to follow. The sea keeps things, the sea returns things. There is something in the combination of those two qualities that people find appropriate to the occasion of a long commitment. What is interesting about the romantic bottle is that it depends more than the scientific bottle or the schoolchild's bottle on the existence of a finder. The proposal or the letter or the anniversary note sent into the sea is not useful without someone to read it, which means that embedded in the gesture is an act of trust, not in the recipient who already knows something is coming, but in the sea itself, and in the existence of a stranger somewhere on an unnamed shoreline who will, at some unknown point, reach down and pick up what has been sent. The bereaved are different again. Coastal communities across Northern Europe, North America, and the Pacific Islands have documented the practice of releasing sealed bottles containing letters addressed to people who have died. The bottles are sent because the sea offers what graveyards and ceremonies sometimes cannot: the sensation of release, the physical act of letting go of something rather than keeping it. The letter goes out of the hand, the water takes it. The act is complete in a way that is difficult to replicate through other means. Several cases reported by the BBC over the years involved finders who recognized, on reading the message inside a recovered bottle, that the letter had been written to a deceased person, a parent, a spouse, a child. In these cases, finders often reached out to maritime heritage organizations or local press rather than contacting any address given in the letter, uncertain whether direct contact would be welcome. Some of those finders were put in touch with the sender's family. The conversations that followed were documented in regional coverage as careful and considerate encounters between strangers, connected by a piece of glass and a sealed letter. The handling of such a bottle, once it has been found and read and understood, requires a kind of sensitivity that most people appear naturally to bring to it. There is something in the physical object itself, in the fact of its survival and its arrival, that seems to instruct a certain quietness. People who find memorial bottles tend not to speak about them lightly. They hold them carefully before they decide what to do. This is equally true of the senders, for whom the ritual of preparation, the writing of the letter, the choice of the bottle, the sealing, the the decision about where to release it carries a weight that is separate from grief and continuous with it. The care that goes into a memorial bottle is not different in kind from the care a sailor puts into noting his coordinates, or a scientist puts into numbering a postcard. It is attention paid to an object that is about to leave, given to a process whose outcome cannot be known, offered to a body of water that will take it wherever it is going without any particular acknowledgement of what it carries. The Atlantic receives all of these with the same indifference. The schoolchild's bottle, and the fisherman's bottle, and the proposal, and the memorial letter go into the same water and are carried by the same surface currents without distinction. The glass makes no announcement. The seal holds, or it does not. The bottle arrives somewhere, or it does not arrive. What was inside was particular and private and specific to the person who wrote it, and the sea has no interest in that. It simply moves. What remains consistent across all these categories of sender, the schoolchild, the sailor, the scientist, the romantic, the bereaved, is the willingness to commit something to a process that cannot be supervised. This is perhaps the most fundamental thing all bottle senders share, and it runs across cultures and centuries and very different kinds of motivation. The bottle is a form of patience. It is the decision to send rather than keep. It is the acknowledgement that the thing being sent is now out of the sender's control, and that this is, on some level, the point. The Cornish schoolchildren understood this in the way children understand things that are also felt rather than only explained. The teacher had described how water moves, had drawn diagrams, had named the currents. But the lesson that the child standing in the shallows actually received was simpler and harder to diagram, that the world is large enough to take something from your hand and carry it somewhere you cannot follow. Some children followed up, in the weeks after their beach release, with letters to the school asking whether their bottle had been found. Most had no way of knowing. A few, over the years, received reports from finders who had returned the cards from as far away as the Spanish coast, the Azores, occasionally the shores of Ireland. These reports arrived in ordinary envelopes posted by strangers who had done the small particular act of kindness involved in sitting down and writing back to an address printed on a card inside a bottle they had found on a beach. That act, the finder writing back, is the moment the bottle becomes correspondence. Before that, it is an object in transit. After that, it is a letter that has been received and answered. The schools kept these responses in folders. Some programs kept records going back decades, tracking release points and recovery points as longitudinal data sets. Others kept them more informally, in binders or boxes, as accumulated evidence of the educational experiment's results. In either case, the responses from finders were treated as what they were, replies. The conversation had taken years to complete, had crossed several hundred miles of open water, and had passed through the hands of the sea, and then the hands of a stranger before arriving, but it had arrived. This is also how the Marine Biological Association's numbered postcards worked, though on a more deliberate institutional scale. The return postcard in each bottle was pre-addressed to the association in Plymouth. A finder who recovered the bottle was asked to fill in the date and location and post the card back, a simple request, requiring minimal effort, but one that depended entirely on the willingness of a stranger to participate in a project they had not been told about in advance and had no obligation to join. A substantial number of finders did join. The response rate across the roughly 1,000 bottles released between 1906 and 1916 was high enough to generate baseline data sets that informed early 20th century models of North Atlantic circulation. Those models were later digitized and compared against modern oceanographic simulations. The stranger on the shore who posted a numbered card back to Plymouth in 1909 or 1912 did not know they were contributing to a data set that would still be in use more than 100 years later. They simply found a bottle, read the card, and did what the card asked. That willingness to participate without foreknowledge, to complete a request made by an institution or a person who had no way of knowing the finder existed, appears again and again in the documented history of bottle recoveries. It is not universal. Many bottles are never returned, never acknowledged, never reported, but a consistent pattern of strangers doing the small concrete work of reply shows up across the archives, in maritime heritage records, and institutional correspondence, and local newspaper reports, and national media coverage of the more striking cases. The finder takes the bottle home, reads what is inside, decides that someone somewhere would probably want to know, and does the work of trying to reach them. The fisherman who wrote his coordinates on a slip of paper and sealed it into a bottle from a working vessel in the North Sea was extending the same quiet trust, not in any particular person, but in the general possibility that someone would eventually find it and consider it worth responding to. That trust was placed in the water first, which is the larger and more uncertain trust, and in the hypothetical finder second. Both of those trusts were, in a measurable number of cases, repaid. There is a category of bottle release that sits slightly apart from the others, not scientific, not romantic, not memorial, and not pedagogical, but personal in a way that is harder to classify. These are the bottles released by individuals who had no particular audience in mind and no particular message to send, but who felt, on a specific day, standing at a specific edge of water, that sending something was the right action. The reasons given in the few documented cases of this kind tend to be imprecise. Something about wanting to mark the day, something about wanting to send a thought outward, something about the act of release being satisfying in itself, regardless of outcome. These bottles, when found and reported, tend to contain the simplest messages: a name, a date, sometimes a sentence or two about where the sender was standing and what the weather was like. They are not addressed to anyone. They do not request a reply. They are records of a moment, sealed and sent. The finders of these bottles are often the ones who are most uncertain what to do. The bottle contains no address, no return information, no request. There is no obvious next step. Some finders simply keep the bottle, or post about it in local media, or bring it to a maritime heritage organization. Some find the sender through the date and the location and the name, following trails of local records or internet searches. Some do not try and keep the bottle on a shelf as an object whose story they are content to leave partially unknown. These are the bottles that accumulate quietly in small collections, in the back rooms of lighthouse museums, in the private collections of habitual beachcombers on the Faroe Islands or the outer coasts of Scotland, unreturned, not because they were unwelcome, but because there was no clear path back. The sender released them into the open. The finder received them in the same spirit. The exchange was, in its own way, complete. The child on the Cornwall beach, watching her bottle move through the white water and out into the green, was not thinking about any of this. She was watching the glass until she could not see it anymore, which is the complete and sufficient response to the act of sending. The water took it. That was the whole lesson. What the bottles share, from the numbered cards of the Marine Biological Association to the marriage proposal released off Virginia to the fisherman's coordinates, written in the practice shorthand of someone for whom latitude and longitude are the natural language of location, is the quality of having been prepared with care. Each was sealed. Each contained something the sender considered worth preserving against the water and the time. Each was given over at a specific moment on a specific shoreline or vessel deck to a process larger than the person giving. Some of those preparations were practical and institutional. Some were domestic and private, carried out at a kitchen table with ordinary stationery and whatever bottle happened to be on hand. Some were elaborately ceremonial, the bottle selected specifically, the paper chosen for quality, the seal applied with particular attention. All of them resulted in the same thing, a glass object, floating, carrying a piece of paper inside it across water that had no opinion about the contents. The sailor, logging his coordinates in the small margin of a release note, understood that the data might be useful or might not be, might be found or might not be, might be returned or might not be, and sent the bottle anyway because the alternative, keeping the note, had no possibility attached to it. The child understood the same thing more simply, in the way children understand through action rather than reasoning, and let the bottle go into the wave with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet learned to require assurance before acting. The bottle with the marriage proposal carried, inside its sealed glass, the willingness to make a gesture that could be ignored, misunderstood, or never received, and to make it anyway because the gesture was part of what was being offered. The bereaved individual who stood at the water's edge, holding a letter addressed to the dead, was not expecting a reply. The release was the completion of the act, not the beginning of a correspondence. All of these motivations fold back, eventually, to the same impulse, the impulse to send something outward, to give it to the sea, to accept that what happens next is not one's to determine. This is not a lesson that requires a classroom or a diagram. It is available on any coastline, in any weather, to anyone willing to stand at the edge of the water and hold something and then not hold it. The Marine Biological Association prepared their row of numbered bottles with the same knowledge arranged into careful institutional form. Each bottle in the row was identical to the ones beside it. Each contained the same postcard, the same printed request, a different number. They were set out in order, waiting before the vessel reached the release position. When the position was reached, they went into the water one by one. Some of those bottles returned their data within the year. Some returned it within a decade. One returned it in 108 years. The association had not specified a deadline. The postcard simply asked for the date and location of recovery and a return address to Plymouth. The sea kept the bottles for whatever period of time it chose, and then, when they reached a shore, the people on that shore did what most people do when they find something carefully made and clearly addressed. They considered who it was for, and they sent it on. The row of identical bottles laid out on a working research vessel somewhere in the North Atlantic in the early years of the 20th century, numbered in sequence, each one prepared with the same attention, each one holding the same printed question and a different coordinate, is a small, complete picture of human curiosity at its most patient. The scientists who prepared them could not follow them. They could not correct them if the seal failed, could not redirect them if the currents carried them somewhere unexpected. They could only prepare each one carefully, put it into the sea, and wait for whatever answered. The gravel on the Faroe Islands makes a particular sound underfoot, a low shifting crunch that carries in the wind and then is swallowed by it, again and again with each step. In the early morning, when the North Atlantic light is still flat and pale and the kelp on the drift line glistens dark against the pale stones, a person walking that shore would hear their own footsteps as the loudest thing for a long stretch in either direction. The smell is dense and particular, cold salt, and something older underneath it, the specific mineral weight of things the sea has been turning over for a very long time. When the beachcomber stoops to lift a sealed glass bottle from where it has settled among the weed and the rounded stones, the weight of it is the first fact. It is heavier than expected. Wet glass and sea cold, and the solid resistance of something that has been sealed shut and carried a long way and arrived whole. The drift line on a Faroe Islands beach is not like a drift line anywhere warmer. It is a dense, compressed catalog of what the North Atlantic has been carrying. Boards of timber, lengths of rope gone dark with age, the hollow bodies of plastic containers faded to colors that have no name, and occasionally, among all of it, something sealed and glass and still intact. The people who walk these beaches habitually, and there are always a few, in communities where the coastline is close and the practice is old, develop an eye for what does not belong to the general category of the shore itself. A glass bottle is not rock, it does not behave like kelp. Even half buried in a drift line, in poor light, at a distance, there is something about the shape that does not sit the same way as everything around it. The beachcombers, who have made the majority of historically significant bottle discoveries, tend to live in places like this: remote coastlines, shores that sit at the receiving end of current patterns that deposit ocean drift with particular consistency. The Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, the northern coasts of Norway, the outer reaches of the Scottish archipelago, these are not accidental collecting points. The geography that makes them remote is the same geography that makes the currents deposit things there, and the people who have spent decades walking those shores have had more practice than almost anyone at reading what the sea brings in. Many of them could not tell a person the technical name for the current that crosses their beach. They simply know what the tide drops, and where, and at what time of year the drift line is richest. There is a particular stillness to the moment of lifting an unknown sealed bottle from wet stones. The gravel shifts and resettles, the weight settles into the hands. The glass, which may be green or brown or nearly clear, holds the light of whatever kind of morning it happens to be, and the paper inside, if paper is visible, is pressed against the interior wall in the way that paper settles when it has been still for a long time. The beachcomber holds it up. The overcast light passes through the curve of the glass. What is inside is still unread. The bottle is simply here, solid and cold, and the walk that led to it was ordinary, and the moment itself is quiet, and whatever the paper says is still sealed inside and waiting. Commercial fishermen working the North Sea have encountered sealed bottles under entirely different circumstances. Not on a beach, not in morning light, but far from any shore, at the surface of the open water, or more often still, hauled up inside a trawling net, along with the catch, discovered on the wet deck of a working vessel, the bottle rolling among the fish and the water and the general weight of what has come up from the sea. The discovery of a sealed bottle in a trawling net is reported in Norwegian, Danish, and Scottish fishing industry publications throughout the 20th century, a recurring detail in a working life that does not ordinarily produce such things. A fisherman would notice it immediately. Glass does not belong in a net. It is both lighter and more fragile than everything else that comes up, and the fact that it arrived intact, cork still tight, contents still dry, is itself a small structural achievement that the water and the net and the pressure of the hull all conspired against. The fisherman who pulls a sealed bottle free from the catch and sets it aside on the deck is doing something that has a long precedent in the trade, though most of those who did it would not have known that. The bottle goes to one side. Work continues. Later, In a quieter moment, the cork is examined. The condition of the seal is assessed with the same practical attention a fisherman brings to everything on deck, not ceremonially, but with the specific interest of someone whose daily work is the surface of the sea and everything it holds. The paper inside, if paper is what the bottle contains, is still dry. Whatever was written on it was written somewhere by someone and lowered over the side of something, and here it is now, having traveled from that moment to this one by a route no one on this deck was witness to. The open water position of a fisherman's discovery is significant in a way that a shore recovery cannot replicate. When a bottle is found on a beach, the finder can note the beach, the date, the tide, the drift line, but the bottle's final approach to land is unknown. It might have been circling close to that shore for months before settling into the kelp. When a bottle is hauled up in a net, far from any coastline, the recovery coordinates are precise. The position of the vessel at that moment, recorded in the ship's log as a matter of standard practice, places the bottle at a specific latitude and longitude in open water, far from the distortions of near-shore current patterns. This is recovery data that a shore-based finder could never supply, and it has informed the broader picture of how bottles actually move through open ocean, not as a smooth, unbroken transit, but as a slow, irregular drift that can hold a bottle at sea for years before any coast draws close enough to catch it. Norwegian and Danish fishing vessels operating in the northern North Sea have contributed a disproportionate number of such open water recoveries to the archival record, for the same reason that Norwegian and Danish coastlines collect a disproportionate share of shore-based drift material. The geometry of the basin, the pattern of the prevailing winds, and the depth of the fishing grounds all place these vessels in territory where the current carries things. A fisherman working those waters for 20 or 30 years would almost certainly encounter a sealed bottle more than once. Some of them kept the bottles, some forwarded the contents to the maritime authorities. Some wrote back, if there was an address to write to, in the careful handwriting of people who compose correspondence infrequently and choose their words with the practical economy of the trade. Children who found sealed bottles during family beach holidays occupy a different position in this archive entirely. The circumstances are very particular. A summer shore, a family spread across the beach, the ordinary permissions of a holiday that allow a child to wander and pick up things that would not ordinarily be picked up. The tide's edge in southern England, on a sunny afternoon, is a place where the boundary between what is interesting and what is ordinary shifts moment to moment. Something half visible in wet sand is worth bending toward. A sealed glass bottle, pulled free with both hands, heavy with the cold water still beaded on its surface, is immediately and obviously different from anything else the tide has left. The child carries it up the beach. The adults gather. The paper inside is read or attempted, and the address, if an address is what the paper contains, becomes the start of a conversation about distance, about time, about what to do next. In verified cases from the coasts of Florida, southern England, and the Baltic Sea, children who found sealed bottles during family beach holidays were able, in the days and weeks that followed, to follow up with the original senders through contact information preserved inside. The letters or cards had survived the journey in readable condition. The addresses were still legible. Regional newspapers reported on several such cases. The discovery, the letter, the contact, the response from the sender or the sender's family, with the child's involvement treated as the detail that gave the story its particular quality. There is something in the image of a child as the finder that the surrounding adults seem to find quietly satisfying, as though the chance element of the discovery is somehow made more apparent by the fact that it was not a scientist or a maritime professional who found it, but someone on a holiday in sandals looking for shells. The Baltic Sea cases are particularly well documented because the Baltic is a relatively enclosed body of water with its own circulatory patterns and a long shoreline of densely populated coastline, meaning that bottles released into it are more likely to reach a finder within a shorter time and a shorter distance than bottles released into an open ocean basin. A child finding a bottle on a Baltic beach in Germany might be holding something released a few years earlier from a vessel in the northern reaches of the same sea, close enough in ocean terms that the paper inside has barely begun to soften and the ink is still dark and the address is as clear as if it had been written the week before. The contact that follows is less a recovery from deep time and more a conversation slightly delayed by geography. The finder and the sender may still be alive at similar stages of life. The letter inside may describe a world that still exists in recognizable form. Before the widespread automation of lighthouses throughout the 20th century, the keepers of remote coastal and offshore stations lived a kind of life that made them among the most attentive observers of what the sea brought to their particular stretch of shore. At a lighthouse, in a community of 2 or 3 people on a rock, or a headland far from the nearest town, the boundary of the world was the boundary of what could be seen from the lamp gallery. What the sea carried in was genuinely interesting in a way that required no elaboration. A sealed glass bottle found on the rocks below the light, or washed up in the small cove that served as the station's only approach from the water, was an event worth noting, not a remarkable event, not one that interrupted the ordinary work of the station in any serious way, but worth noting in the log, in the careful handwriting that lighthouse keepers brought to everything they recorded. Lighthouse museums in Scotland and Norway and along the eastern coast of North America today preserve original station logs that contain, among all the ordinary observations of weather and vessel traffic and equipment status, entries describing the discovery of sealed bottles, the date, the location on the nearby shore or the rocks below, a description of the bottle's condition, glass intact, cork in place, paper dry or slightly damp, seal unbroken, and then the text of the message inside, transcribed as faithfully as the keeper could manage, preserved in the log exactly as any other maritime observation would be. Some of these logs are held in archival collections and are available to researchers. The entries about bottles are brief and factual and placed without ceremony between entries about fog and entries about the condition of the light mechanism, which is perhaps the most appropriate context for them. One piece of information about the sea, among the many pieces of information about the sea that were the daily work of the station. At Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, where the lighthouse has stood since the 19th century, and where the waters offshore are among the most navigated and most closely observed on the eastern seaboard, lighthouse records include bottle discoveries made during the years when keepers lived at the station in continuous rotation. The Outer Banks, the long narrow strip of barrier islands of which Cape Hatteras is a part, sit at a position where the warm northward flowing Gulf Stream meets the cooler southward flowing waters from the north, a confluence that creates conditions in which floating objects arrive from a remarkable variety of points of origin. A keeper at Cape Hatteras could, over a long enough tenure, find bottles that had come from the Caribbean, from the North Atlantic, from vessels anywhere along the eastern seaboard. The log entries make no claim about origin. They record only what was found, and where, and what was inside. The practice of forwarding the contents to maritime authorities or scientific institutions mentioned in some of these lighthouse records, reflects the institutional awareness that these finds had value beyond their immediate novelty. A keeper who transcribed a message and sent the information to a harbor authority or a university oceanographic department was participating, often without knowing it, in a distributed network of observation that was the primary method by which ocean drift was mapped in the era before satellite tracking and autonomous monitoring buoys. Each recovery report, whether forwarded from a lighthouse station, filed by a fishing vessel, or sent in by a shore finder who had read about the scientific value of such reports in a newspaper, added a data point to a picture that no single institution could have assembled on its own. The bottles were the instruments. The finders were the readers of those instruments. The institutions that collected the reports were building something out of the cumulative weight of all those separate moments of discovery. The Coast Guard cases follow a different shape again. A patrol vessel operating in open water, far from any shore, in the ordinary course of checking vessel traffic and monitoring conditions, crosses a stretch of ocean, and the officer on watch sees something floating at the surface that is not a wave, and not a bird, and not a piece of hull debris. The gaff hook comes out. The bottle is lifted from the water cleanly, set on the deck. It is still sealed. The cork has held. Whatever is inside has been carried to this point, somewhere in open water, at a specific latitude and longitude, at a specific time on a specific day, and has now come into contact with an institution whose primary instinct is to make a record. Coast Guard agencies in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Germany have documented procedural histories of logging sealed bottle discoveries made during routine patrol operations. The log entry is the first institutional act. After that, the question becomes what to do with the bottle and its contents, and if the message inside contains a return address, and if that address is legible, and if the institutional resources exist to make contact. The process of reunion between finder and sender begins to move through channels that were designed for other things, but adapt readily enough to this purpose. The United States Coast Guard has served, in several documented cases, as the institutional intermediary that carried a message found in open water all the way to its original sender, crossing national boundaries where necessary, and using the postal services of multiple countries to complete the final leg of a journey that the sea had carried part way. What the Coast Guard officer sees, setting a sealed bottle carefully on the deck of a patrol vessel in open water, is not the beginning of a long institutional process. That is what it becomes. In the moment of discovery, it is simply a bottle on a deck, still closed, still sealed, the contents unknown, the water drying slowly on the glass surface in the wind. The officer notes the position. The log is updated. The bottle is secured. The patrol continues. Whatever was inside that bottle, whatever address, whatever message, whatever name was written on a folded piece of paper by a person who was somewhere entirely different when they wrote it, is still sealed inside, still in transit in a sense. The journey not yet complete, even though the ocean portion of it has ended. The patience that accumulates in these institutional records, the careful logging, the forwarding, the correspondence across agencies, the effort to trace a last known address for someone who may have moved, or may have aged significantly, or may no longer be living at the location written on a card, pressed flat against the interior wall of a bottle, is a particular kind of patience. It is not dramatic. It does not require any single person to carry the whole weight of it. A lighthouse keeper wrote in a log. A maritime authority filed the report. A Coast Guard officer noted a position. A postal service forwarded an envelope. Each step was routine within its own context. The combined effect of all those routine steps was the completion of a journey that the sea had begun and that no single person had the whole of in view. The beachcomber on the Faroe Islands has none of this institutional apparatus available to her when she lifts the bottle from the drift line. What she has is the bottle itself, the cold weight of it in her hands, and the paper inside still pressed flat and unread. She will have to find her own way forward from here, whether that means carrying the bottle home, or finding a local newspaper, or calling a maritime heritage organization, or simply setting it carefully on a windowsill and thinking about it for a while before deciding. The sea has done its part. Everything that follows is a different kind of navigation, conducted over land and through ordinary human channels, moving a piece of information from the moment of its recovery toward the moment of its reading. The bottle made the ocean crossing. The finder makes the rest of the journey. Regional press in coastal communities throughout Scotland, Ireland, Newfoundland, and the Outer Banks of North Carolina has covered bottle discoveries consistently enough over the past century that the stories form their own small genre, recognizable in their shape, varied in their particulars. The finder, the location, the condition of the bottle, the age of the message if age can be established, the effort to trace the sender. Local reporters who have written such stories often describe the particular quality of the finder's manner in holding the bottle, the careful handling, the slight hesitation before opening, the attention paid to a folded piece of paper that has no reason to look remarkable, but carries the weight of its own strange survival. The Newfoundland cases have a particular geographic context. The coastline of Newfoundland sits at the edge of the North Atlantic, in a position that receives drift from a wide arc of open ocean, and the communities that line its shores have maintained a connection to what the sea brings in for as long as those communities have existed. A bottle found on a Newfoundland beach might have come from the European side of the Atlantic, or from vessels operating in the shipping lanes that cross the basin, or from points along the North American coast carried by the currents that flow southward from the Labrador Sea. The finders in Newfoundland tend to have an intuitive sense of where a bottle's origin might lie, based on the prevailing drift patterns in their area, knowledge acquired not from oceanographic texts, but from the accumulated experience of living beside the water and paying attention to what it delivers. The Outer Banks cases carry their own distinct quality because the geography of the barrier islands concentrates drift in ways that create exceptionally rich discovery conditions. A narrow strip of sand sits between the ocean and the protected waters of the Sounds, and the convergence of different water masses offshore means that drift objects arrive there from a wider variety of origins than almost any equivalent stretch of shoreline on the eastern coast. A habitual beachcomber working the Outer Banks in the late 20th century might, over a long season, find drift objects from Europe, from the Caribbean, from vessels anywhere in the mid-Atlantic, and might develop through the simple accumulation of many such finds an informal expertise in reading what the sea was carrying and where it had come from. There is a class of discovery that does not fit neatly into any of the categories above. The find that happens not to a habitual beachcomber, not to a fisherman, not to a lighthouse keeper or a Coast Guard officer, but to a person who was simply present on a shore for reasons that had nothing to do with looking for anything. A person walking between two errands, a couple taking a path they had not taken before, a runner who stopped to catch their breath and looked down. These accidental finders appear throughout the archive of reported bottle discoveries, and their accounts have a quality that the more deliberate finds do not, a sense that the encounter was governed entirely by the chance alignment of a route taken and an object placed, with no predisposition on the finder's part toward finding anything at all. The accidental finder does not know what they are looking at when they look at a sealed glass bottle in the sand. They have no framework of prior experience to bring to it. The bottle is simply there, and they are simply there, and the coincidence of those two facts is the whole of the encounter before the cork comes out, and the paper inside begins to reveal what it has been carrying. The habitual beachcomber brings a practiced eye and an accumulated sense of what shore-cast bottles tend to contain, and how their condition maps onto their likely age and origin. The accidental finder brings none of this, only the ordinary interest of a person who has found something unexpected in a place they happen to be passing through. The archive of such finds is by its nature incomplete. Not every bottle that washes ashore is found. Not every bottle that is found is reported. Not every report makes it into any permanent record. What survives in newspaper archives, maritime logs, institutional collections, and the oral histories of coastal communities is a fraction of the actual total, a sample large enough to reveal patterns, but not large enough to give the full count. The true number of bottles found on beaches and in nets and in the logs of remote lighthouses and on the decks of Coast Guard vessels is certainly larger than any archive contains, by a multiple that no one can calculate with any precision. What is counted is what was reported. What was reported is what someone thought was worth reporting. The rest settles quietly into the history of people walking shores and picking up things and not writing them down. Among the finds that were written down, a particular pattern recurs across geographies and across decades. The finder, having read the message inside, is briefly held by the specific combination of distance and time that the object in their hands represents. The bottle has come a long way. It has been at sea for a long time. The person who wrote the note, whoever they were, wherever they were when they wrote it, is distant in both space and time from this beach, this hand, this moment. What the finder holds is a kind of physical proof of an elapsed interval, proof that time passed and the bottle persisted in it, proof that distance was crossed and the glass held, proof that a folded piece of paper survived conditions that might easily have destroyed it. What happens next depends on what the message says. If it contains an address, there is something to do, a letter to write, a telephone to use, if the address leads to a working number, a newspaper to call, if the story seems worth the telling. If the message contains no return address, or if the address is no longer legible, the bottle has arrived at the end of its journey without providing a clear way forward. The finder has the glass. They have whatever fragments of ink survived the crossing. The connection that the bottle was sent out to make is only partial, or it is absent entirely, and the finder is left holding an object that made a remarkable journey toward nothing that can be identified or named from here. These cases, the partial recoveries, the eligible addresses, the messages without a sender's name, do not make the archive, but they exist alongside it. Every lighthouse keeper who transcribed a message and could not identify an origin, every fisherman who read a name on a folded card that dissolved into illegibility before anyone else could read it, every beachcomber who found the glass intact and the paper inside too far gone to read. The bottle made its crossing. The paper did not survive it. The two facts coexist without resolving into anything a record can hold. The ones that do resolve, the ones where address leads to sender, where sender receives word from finder, where the chain of ordinary forwarding eventually completes itself, are the cases that the archive preserves most clearly, and they have a quality of satisfaction that is proportional to the difficulty of the crossing they record. A bottle found within months of its release, close to its origin point, containing a legible message and a clear return address, and successfully forwarded. This is satisfying, but not unusual. a bottle found after decades on a shore thousands of miles from its origin, containing paper still dry enough to read and an address still clear enough to trace. This sits in a different register of satisfaction, one that seems to require some acknowledgement beyond the merely practical. The Coast Guard officer setting the sealed bottle carefully on the deck of the patrol vessel is in that moment at the pivot point between the journey the sea made and the journey the institutional apparatus will make. Behind the bottle is open water and weeks or months or years of drift, and a release point somewhere over the horizon that the bottle has no way of naming. Ahead of it is the log entry, the careful examination of the contents, the question of what address is written inside and whether it can still be found, the forwarding, the correspondence, the quiet conclusion of a transit that neither the sender nor the finder fully understood while it was happening. The bottle sits on the deck, the wind moves across it. The surface of the water slides past the hull of the patrol vessel as it continues on its route, moving away from the position where the bottle was lifted and toward the next part of the ordinary day. What is inside the bottle has not yet been read. The seal is still intact. The paper inside, pressed flat against the interior glass wall, dry, legible, or nearly so, bearing whatever name and whatever address and whatever words were folded into it at a particular moment in a particular place by a person who was simply doing what it occurs to people to do. Beside the water, with a glass bottle and a piece of paper, is still making its way toward the moment of its reading, still sealed, still in transit, still on the last leg of its crossing, the deck of the patrol vessel carrying it now through open water toward a shore. Under a conservator's lamp in the summer of 2015, a postcard from 1906 held its ink. The lamp is the kind that produces a steady, even light without heat, clinical, precise, designed to reveal rather than to warm. The postcard beneath it had traveled inside a sealed glass bottle for 108 years, carried across the surface of the Baltic Sea, and deposited eventually on a German shore. And what the conservator saw when the light fell across it was not a ruin. The lines of the original handwriting were still there, still holding the specific pressure of the pen that had made them, the letter forms clear enough to read and to photograph. The ink had not bled into the paper. It had not faded to a ghost of itself. It was simply there, patient and intact, in the same position on the card it had occupied when someone printed it aboard a research ship in 1906 and sealed it into a bottle with a cork and let it go. The room around the postcard was quiet. That is worth holding for a moment. 108 years is not an abstraction, but it is difficult to feel as a fact. The lamp helped because the lamp was present, and the postcard was present, and the handwriting was present, and between the handwriting and the conservator's eye, there was nothing, no gap, no translation required, no interpretation needed. The words were simply readable, the same way they would have been readable on the ship deck in 1906, and that continuity across more than a century of ocean exposure and temperature change, and the slow perpetual motion of the water was by any ordinary measure not what one would expect. Conservation scientists who have examined recovered bottle letters in detail note that the primary threat to paper inside a sealed glass bottle is not salt water, it is condensation. When temperature changes, the air trapped inside a sealed container expands and contracts, and moisture moves through those cycles. And over enough time, even in the absence of any external water source, the humidity inside the bottle fluctuates. Cellulose, which is what paper is made of, responds to those fluctuations. It absorbs and releases moisture with the surrounding air, and each cycle of that movement stretches and relaxes the fibers in the sheet, and over decades, those repeated small stresses accumulate. What slows that process considerably is a tight seal, a bottle whose cork held firm, whose glass wall admitted no additional water and allowed no significant exchange of air with the outside environment, creates a condition inside itself that is, by the standards of archival storage, surprisingly stable. The 1906 postcard survived in part because the bottle that held it was genuinely sealed. The cork did not yield over 108 years. The glass did not crack. The small volume of air between the stopper and the folded card changed temperature over and over again across more than a century of seasons, but it remained the same air, the same enclosed space throughout, and the chemistry of degradation inside that space moved more slowly than it would have in almost any ordinary room. Archivists and conservation scientists have noted this with a particular kind of interested attention, because what bottle letters sometimes demonstrate is that the accidental environment of a sealed glass container can outperform conventional library storage conditions over equivalent time spans. The letter that was given to the sea, sealed tightly and left to drift, arrived in better condition than some documents held carefully in dedicated facilities. The accident turned out to be, structurally, quite good for the paper. Ink behaves differently depending on its composition. Iron gall ink, which was common in correspondence well into the early 20th century, involves a chemical reaction between iron salts and tannic acids derived from plant material, producing a compound that bonds strongly to cellulose fibers, rather than sitting only on the surface. Over time, iron gall ink can damage paper through ongoing oxidation. It can eat into the fibers around the written lines, producing a kind of slow, imperceptible corrosion along every stroke of the pen. But in a low oxygen environment, that oxidation slows. The chemistry that would, over long exposure to open air, gradually degrade both the ink and the paper beneath it, simply proceeds more slowly when the oxygen available to drive it is limited and static. A sealed bottle, for all the violence of its journey across open water, provides its contents with a degree of chemical quiet that the outside world, with its constant movement of air and moisture, cannot match. Carbon-based inks, which became increasingly common as the 20th century progressed, are even more stable in enclosed conditions. They sit on the surface of the paper rather than bonding chemically into its fibers, and their primary vulnerability is physical, smearing, flaking, abrasion. Inside a sealed bottle, with the letter folded and held against the interior wall by its own weight and the pressure of the enclosed air, those physical vulnerabilities are largely removed. The letter cannot be rubbed, it cannot be abraded. It sits, and the ink sits with it, and the darkness inside the glass bottle is in its own quiet way a kind of preservation. Photographic paper is more complicated. A family photograph found inside a bottle, recovered on a Cornish beach in the 1990s, demonstrated both the resilience of the bottle environment and its limits. The image had survived in identifiable condition, the faces visible, the composition clear, the poses of the people depicted still readable, but the surface of the photographic paper showed the effects of the humidity cycles in ways that plain writing paper did not.
Because photographic emulsions respond to moisture differently from cellulose. The silver compounds that form the image in a black and white photograph are sensitive to sulfur compounds that can off-gas from the paper itself over time, and that sensitivity means that even in a sealed, stable environment, photographic images face a chemical threat that handwritten text on plain paper does not. That the photograph survived in identifiable condition at all is a product of the bottle's seal remaining intact throughout its journey.
That it showed more surface degradation than the letter it accompanied is a product of the fundamental difference in how photographs and text are made. The finder in that Cornish case held a letter and a photograph, and the photograph meant that before any words had been read, before any address had been decoded, or any contact made, there was already a face. The sender existed as a visible person, standing somewhere outdoors, smiling directly at the camera, the image slightly softened by time, but the features still clear enough to constitute a face, rather than a blur. There is a particular quality to that kind of encounter, when a person materializes from a found object, not as a name first, but as a presence, a physical person captured in the specific ordinary act of posing for a photograph, before the finder knows anything about who that person is, or where they come from, or how long the bottle carrying their image was in the water. The letter that accompanied the photograph provided the sender's name and return address. That address was in England, some distance from the Cornish coast, which meant the bottle had not traveled far in the geographic sense, but it had traveled far in the temporal sense, because the bottle had been at sea long enough for the sender to have moved through a significant portion of their life, between the moment of release and the moment of recovery. The finder's task, having read the letter and noted the address, was to determine whether the person who had written it was still reachable at the place they had named when they wrote it. In cases like this, and there are documented cases across the United Kingdom, Canada, the United States, and Australia, where bottles were recovered 20, 30, or more years after their release, the passage of time between sending and finding creates a kind of practical gap. The address inside the bottle reflects where the sender was. Finding where they are now requires additional steps. Local newspapers in coastal towns have served across several documented cases as intermediaries in exactly this situation. A finder who cannot locate a sender through the address inside the letter, or who wants to make the contact public in the hope that the sender or their family will read it, brings the bottle and its contents to the regional press. The story of the recovery runs in the paper. Readers who recognize the name or the circumstances reach out. Contact is made through a chain of community recognition rather than through direct address, and the bottle's journey, which was always in some sense a public act, an object released into shared water, completes itself through a shared reading rather than a private delivery. The letter that was given to the ocean returns through a local print run, its words now read by an entire coastal community before they reach the person they were addressed to. Postal services have played a quieter, more procedural version of the same role. In several verified cases, per towns as Buell, and finders who located a return address but could not confirm whether the sender still lived there, forwarded the original letter or a transcription of its contents through the ordinary postal system, addressed to the sender's last known location, and with a covering note explaining the circumstances of the bottle's discovery. That envelope, moving through the postal system on the last leg of its journey, traveled in the company of ordinary mail, bills and catalogs, and holiday cards on a route that had nothing to do with ocean currents, or drift patterns, or the particular behavior of glass on the surface of moving water. It moved through sorting machines and distribution centers, and ended up in a mail carrier's bag, and then in a letterbox, and the fact of its arrival was, from the outside, indistinguishable from any other letter delivered on any other morning. Maritime heritage organizations have served in other cases as the institutional memory that made reunion possible. An organization that maintains records of bottle releases from a particular research program, or a particular vessel, or a particular coastal institution can serve as a bridge when a finder has the message but not enough context to locate the sender independently. The finder contacts the organization with the date and the number or the identifying information on the postcard inside the bottle, and the organization locates the corresponding release record, and the chain of contact begins from there. In cases involving research institutions, universities, government oceanographic programs, the Marine Biological Association, the institutional infrastructure that organized the original release also provides the infrastructure for reconnection. The system that sent the bottle out had in some sense already anticipated its return. The Marine Biological Association's numbered drift bottles are a particular case of this kind of organized anticipation. The approximately 1,020 bottles released between 1906 and 1916 each contained a printed postcard bearing a unique number and a request, in multiple languages, for the finder to note the date and location of recovery and return the card to the association's address in Plymouth. The numbered card was not just a message, it was a data collection instrument, a structured request for a specific piece of information sent out in a form that any finder, regardless of their familiarity with the program, could understand and respond to. When Marianne Winkler found bottle number 646B on the Baltic shore near Kiel in 2015, the postcard inside it still carried that return address in Plymouth. The association still existed. The address, after a fashion, was still valid. The bottle had anticipated its own return by more than a century, and the anticipation had held. The question of language is one that the Marine Biological Association had thought through carefully when they printed their postcards in multiple languages. The waters into which the bottles were released were European waters, and the coastlines they might reach were coastlines where English was not the primary language, and the people who found the bottles might not be English speakers. A card printed only in English would limit the circle of finders who could respond. A card printed in English, French, German, and other languages widened that circle substantially, recognizing that the bottle's journey was not predictable and that its finder could be almost anyone on almost any stretch of coastline along the edge of the North Atlantic. That acknowledgement that the sea would decide, not the sender, was built directly into the design of the postcard. Bottles from Japanese oceanographic programs released in the 20th century and recovered on the coasts of North America presented a different version of that language challenge. The recovery of a bottle with Japanese text on its contents, on a beach in Alaska or British Columbia or Washington State, placed the finder in the position of holding something legible to the eye, clearly printed, clearly organized, but not immediately readable. Japanese-speaking community members in coastal towns with significant Japanese heritage populations were sometimes the first point of contact for finders in those cases, and the letter's meaning passed through an intermediary before it could travel further. A person sitting at a table with the finder on one side and the document on the other, reading aloud in one language what had been written in another, the words crossing not just an ocean in a span of time, but also the gap between two systems of written communication that share no common alphabet. That process of translation adds a layer to the recovery that purely intralingual bottle letters do not have. The meaning of the letter was always present in the document. The ink held it, the paper held it, the sealed glass bottle held it across however many miles of open water. But the meaning could not be accessed without someone who could read it, and in a cross-linguistic recovery, that person was not necessarily the finder. The message waited not only in the sealed bottle, but also in the particular skills of a specific human being who happened to be present or reachable, and without that person, the message would have remained closed even after the bottle was opened. English language bottles recovered on the shores of France, Germany, Spain, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden have followed similar paths, the finder holding a letter they cannot read, seeking out a neighbor or a local teacher or a librarian who reads English. The words of the letter being read aloud for the first time in a kitchen or a library in a country the sender had probably never visited. Those readings are, in a way, the moment the letter fully arrives, not when the bottle is lifted from the water, not when the cork is removed, but when the words find a voice that can speak them and a room that can hear them. The arrival of a message is always, at some level, the moment it is understood. Pencil, it turns out, survives exceptionally well inside a sealed glass bottle. Pencil marks are graphite deposited on paper rather than chemically bonded to it, and while graphite can be smeared or rubbed from a surface, it does not fade in the way that some inks do, does not react chemically with the paper beneath it in ways that might compromise either the mark or the fiber, and does not bleach out in response to light, because there is no light inside a sealed bottle. Several documented bottle letters containing pencil-written addresses have remained legible after decades of ocean exposure, and in at least some cases, finders have been able to read a return address written in pencil as clearly as if it had been written in ink the week before. The medium that seems most provisional, the one that can be erased, the one that children use before they are trusted with pens, turns out to have particular qualities that make it, in the specific conditions of a sealed bottle, a durable choice. Ink, of course, is the more common medium in historical bottle letters, and the full range of inks used across 2 centuries of documented bottle correspondence covers a wide spectrum of survival rates. Iron gall inks in pre-20th century letters have survived in some cases and deteriorated significantly in others, with the outcome depending heavily on the quality of the paper used alongside them and the integrity of the bottle's seal. Blue-black fountain pen inks from the mid-20th century have shown generally good survival in recovered examples. Ballpoint inks, common from the 1940s onward, sit on the surface of the paper in a way that is broadly similar to pencil, not chemically embedded in the fiber, but physically present on it, and have performed well in conditions where the paper itself remained dry. The paper inside a recovered bottle sometimes tells its own story separate from the words written on it. Watermarks on fine writing paper can allow researchers to narrow down the period in which the letter was written with considerable precision, even when the date noted on the letter itself is unclear or absent. The specific texture and weight of the paper can be compared to commercial paper stocks known to have been available in particular decades or regions. Even the way the letter is folded, the specific fold pattern used to fit the paper into the neck of the bottle, the direction of the creases, can be consistent across a regional tradition of bottle letter sending that a researcher familiar with the practice can recognize. None of these details are what the finder first notices. What the finder first notices, uniformly across the documented accounts, is whether there is something inside the bottle, whether the shape half visible through the glass is paper, whether there is text visible, whether the letter is upright or fallen, intact or damaged. The question of legibility comes next, and then the question of language, and then the question of what the words say, and then the longer question of whether the person who wrote them is reachable. The sequence moves from object to document to language to meaning to person, and each step is a small threshold that the finder crosses while the bottle sits on a surface somewhere nearby. Open now, its journey complete, the cork set to one side. A finder in a small town on the Newfoundland coast in the early 1990s received a bottle that had been at sea for more than 20 years. The return address inside was for a location in Scotland, and the finder had no direct means of reaching Scotland, no institutional contact, no obvious intermediary. What they had was the letter, a local post office, and the address. They wrote their own letter describing the recovery, the date, the location on the Newfoundland shore, the condition of the bottle and its contents, and addressed it to the sender's Scottish address, putting it in the mail with no particular expectation of what would happen. The letter moved through the Canadian postal system, crossed the Atlantic by air, and was delivered by the British Postal Service to a town in Scotland, where it arrived at an address that had belonged, for more than 2 decades, to a family who recognized the name on the original bottle's return address as their own. Maritime heritage organizations in several countries now maintain registries that allow this kind of contact to happen more efficiently than a direct post to a decades-old address. A finder who contacts such an organization with the contents of a recovered letter can, in some cases, be connected within days to an institution that holds release records, community networks, or archival resources that make it possible to trace the original sender or their family with considerably more reliability than sending a letter to an address that may no longer be current. The United States Coast Guard, in particular, has served in documented cases as the institutional intermediary that moved a bottle story across national lines, receiving a recovered bottle through official maritime channels, logging its contents, and initiating contact with the relevant coastal authority in the country where the sender's return address was located. The whole process moving through institutional channels that turned the chance of a bottle's recovery into a confirmed and documented reunion. The documented reunions that have resulted from all of this, from the chance finding and the careful steps that follow it, cover a considerable range of emotional registers. Some are brief correspondences, letters exchanged 2 or 3 times before the novelty of the connection settles, and both parties return to their separate lives. Some have been reported in national and regional media as extended relationships, with the finder and sender meeting in person, sometimes crossing significant distances to do so, the meeting itself carrying a quality that both parties seem to find difficult to describe precisely. The bottle is often present at those meetings, brought by the finder, handled by the sender who sees it for the first time since releasing it, the glass and cork and seal unchanged from the moment the bottle was given to the water, everything else around it having moved through decades of ordinary time. What persists in those accounts across the different countries and coastlines and time spans involved is the specific surprise of contact. The sender who released a bottle into the sea generally did so with some awareness that the odds of recovery and response were low. The act of sending was, in most cases, understood to be an act of possibility rather than of expectation, a gesture directed at open water, at chance, at whatever combination of current and wind and geography might eventually bring the bottle to rest somewhere within reach of a human hand. The fact of recovery, when it comes, arrives against that background of low expectation, and its arrival is therefore not just the receipt of information, but the confirmation that the possibility, which existed abstractly at the moment of release, actually resolved into an event. Someone found it. Someone read it. Someone wrote back. The letters that have survived inside sealed glass bottles over periods of 10, 20, 50, or 100 years were not, for the most part, written with any expectation of literary permanence. They were written by school children following a teacher's instructions, by fishermen recording their position and the name of their vessel, by researchers printing identical postcards for systematic oceanographic data collection, by couples marking a moment they wanted to send out into the world, by people who wanted to direct a few words toward the horizon and see what happened. The writing in most of these letters is plain and practical. It gives a name, an address, a date, sometimes a brief statement of the circumstances of the sending. What makes those plain words remarkable is not what they say, but the fact that they still say it, that the ink held, and the paper held, and the glass held, and whatever the ocean did to the bottle over the years of its transit, those words arrived on the other side, still intact, still readable, still carrying the specific moment in which they were written, like a sealed room that opened when the cork was removed. A sealed bottle is, in a very concrete physical sense, a small preserved atmosphere. The air inside it is the air of the moment when the cork went in, the temperature and humidity and chemical composition of the air on that particular shore or that particular deck on that particular day. The paper inside breathes that air, nothing else, for however long the journey takes. The ink sits in that air, reacting only with what that small fixed volume of atmosphere contains. The glass holds all of it still, and the water moves around the outside of the glass. And years pass, and the bottle drifts, and somewhere on a different shore, in a different season, a hand reaches down and lifts it, and in the moment the cork is drawn, that original air meets the new air of a different place and time.
Sultrot.
And whatever small chemical exchange happens in that meeting is the last event of the bottle's transit, and the letter it carried has arrived. Not all bottles that were released have been found. The great majority have not. They sit somewhere on the floor of the ocean, or they broke against rocks long before any finder could reach them, or they are still moving, still carried by water that has been pushing at them for decades, still heading somewhere. The ones that were found represent a small fraction of the total number released, and the ones whose contents survived legibly enough to be read are a fraction of those, and the ones that led to documented contact between sender and finder are smaller still. The archive of recovered bottle letters is not the archive of what was sent, it is the archive of what the sea chose to return, and it returned it according to no selection principle that takes legibility or significance into account. A bottle containing a child's first careful sentence about the color of the ocean made it to shore in identifiable condition. A bottle containing a careful researcher's numbered card returned its data across a century. A bottle containing a family photograph delivered a face across decades of water. The selection was entirely the ocean's, and the ocean applied no criteria. What the documents show, the lighthouse logs, and the Coast Guard records, and the newspaper archives, and the maritime heritage registries, and the conservators' reports, is that the practice of sending a message in a bottle has been continuous across a very long span of time, and a very wide range of human purposes, and that the practice of finding and following up on those messages has been equally continuous, and that the two practices together have produced, across 2 centuries of documented cases, a remarkable set of contacts between strangers and between members of the same family, between people on opposite sides of oceans and people on the same stretch of coastline, between the living and the records of the no longer living, between institutions that sent bottles as instruments of systematic inquiry and the ordinary people who found those instruments washed up in the seaweed at the edge of the tide.